Well, I'm just going to start because I thought there were two things in the readings today that are maybe a good warm-up for Mr. Emerson here. And the one was from the Psalm, right? When the psalmist says, I have more understanding than all my teachers. For your decrees are my study. I'm wiser than the elders because I observe your commandments.
Yes,
right? So if you want to sort of read Emerson that way, right? So then Emerson would say, yeah, exactly, right? Because I am at the source. Because I am at the source, I'm wiser than everybody. And then in the second reading, Paul is warning because the time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander away to myths. Right, so that might speak to Emerson as well, right? So he's, yeah. So it really is interesting because Emerson is sort of both of these, right? On the one hand, he is the guy who thinks he's going back to the source because we're all made in the image of God and because we have that within us, and therefore we're wiser than our teachers because we have direct access. And maybe Emerson is also a little bit wandering away from sound doctrine according to some people. So I thought it was just kind of fun to see in both of these readings ways of looking at Emerson. And we left off last week on page 5, and I'll sort of lead you through the next few pages because we don't have time to do everything, but I thought I'd sort of give you some of what I consider the highlights of the next few pages and leave lots of room for questions. So we had talked last week, if you weren't here, about his rant against conformity. Because he thinks everybody has everything, we need in us, and we should speak what's in us, unafraid. Conforming to what somebody else wants us to do is a betrayal of, the God within, right? The goodness that we have. And therefore conforming to a teacher, to a church, to anything for Emerson is a kind of death. And so then if you look at the very bottom of page 5, he says the very last line, your conformity explains nothing. That's the very bottom of page 5. Act singly, and what you have already done singly will justify you now. Right? And so for Emerson, you have to have a genuine action and be fully in it, right? With singleness of purpose and without distraction, without a scattered force. And if you do that, then you are wiser than the elders and have more understanding than all your teachers. So that's, again, one of those nuggets, I think, where we see sort of, it's like an aphorism where we see all of Emerson, right? That's why last week we had the famous line that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, right? In the middle of page 5, that gets often quoted, because if you're foolishly consistent, well, then you're not speaking what is true to you. Yeah, and so then, on page 6, he talks about, he hopes that we have heard the last of conformity of consistency. And in that, you kind of see how American Emerson is, right? Because America is also doesn't conform necessarily to the European mold. And that is good in many ways and also bad in some other ways, right? So depending on what your view of America is, sort of, you probably also have different readings of Emerson, because a lot of this American forward-lookingness is wonderful, right? There's a lot of energy there, but of course, there's also very little respect for tradition there. And so Emerson articulates that in many ways.
Yeah, but he's very frustrating, this man.
Oh, sure.
He argues with himself and argues with us
Yeah.
So if we were consistent and conforming to his concept, he'd still be mad because we were conforming and being consistent.
That's right. That's right. So, but that's kind of nice, right? You can't be an Emersonian.
It's impossible to become an Amazonian.
And so
I like
at least, no, and he wouldn't want you to be an Emersonian, right? And so that's in many ways, one can, I think Emerson would rather have you disagree violently with him than to say, sir, yes, sir.
He says, don't cross me, but don't follow me.
Exactly, right? You're going to have to do greater stuff than I did. And I want to point out something on page 7. So this is, you've probably heard the term transcendentalism, thrown out with Emerson. And so, Elaine, if you could read that bottom paragraph. The magnetism, yeah. And just read there and I'll stop you sort of 5-6 lines from the bottom. And this sort of gets to the point of what we're doing when we're self-reliant and what our relationship to something transcendental is when we're self-reliant.
Mm-hmm. The magnetism which all original action exerts is explained when we inquire the reason of self-trust. Who is the trustee? What is the aboriginal self on which a universal reliance may be grounded? What is the nature and power of that science-baffling star without parallax, without calculable elements, which shoots a ray of beauty even into trivial and impure actions, if the least mark of independence appear? The inquiry leads us to that source, at once the essence of genius, of virtue, and of life, which we call spontaneity or instinct. We denote this primary wisdom as intuition, whilst all later teachings are tuitions. In that deep force, the last fact behind which analysis cannot go, all things find their common origin. For the sense of being, which in calm hours rises, we know not how, in the soul, is not diverse from things, from space, from light, from time, from man, but one with them, and proceeds obviously from the same source, whence their life and being also proceed. We first share the life by which things exist, and afterwards see them as appearances in nature and forget that we have shared their cause. Here is the fountain of action and of thought. Here are the lungs of that inspiration which giveth man wisdom, and which cannot be denied without impiety and atheism. We lie in the lap of immense intelligence, which makes us receivers of its truth and organs of its activity. When we discern justice, when we discern truth, we do nothing of ourselves, but allow a passage to its beams. If we ask whence this comes, if we seek to pry into the soul that causes, all philosophy is at fault. Its presence or its absence is all we can affirm.
Thank you. So this is sort of his way of describing that when you're self-reliant, you're actually just letting the ever blessed one, he calls it somewhere else, he uses the word God somewhere else, pass through you. So that's the maybe a paradoxical view of self-reliance, right? Because it says we lie in the lap of an immense intelligence, which makes us receivers of its truth and organs of its activity, right? So our self-reliance is actually more being a medium to the transcendent, is what Emerson would argue.
It makes
That's what I meant by that persistent widow. That's that voice. Yeah.
That we have to listen to exactly and then open ourselves up to, and then if we let her in, right, and then speak what we just heard, then Emerson would say we're self-reliant, and maybe the religious person would say you're giving voice to God or something. Yeah.
But they were saying, I like that Is what I'm saying.
What would he do with today's world of bombardment of with information and technology? And would he like this, or would he decry it?
He seems, I mean, he says several times that you have to sort of leave the hubbub of the marketplace behind in order to, right, as he says, sort of discern truth and allow passage to its beams, right? I mean, almost quite literally, you can't allow passage to the beams from above if there's all kinds of interference.
But to discern truth, you have to go through all of it. You have to take everything in.
But mainly the persistent widow, not the, internet troll and flashing lights. So I think he would, and that's the trick, right? How do you discern that this is the right voice, right, that's coming to you? And I think well, I mean, let me just briefly jump to the next page. At the bottom of page 8, 5 lines up from the bottom, he says, if we live truly, we shall see truly. It is as easy, these are the last few lines on page 8. It is as easy for the strong man to be strong as it is for the weak to be weak. When we have new perception, we shall gladly disperse the memory of its hoarded treasures as old rubbish. When a man lives with God, his voice shall be as sweet as the murmur of the brook and the rustle of the corn. I don't know if that's enough of an answer, right? But he would say, if you live truly, right? So if you have sort of conduct yourself that you are a clean vessel, so to speak, right? Then you're like the radio antenna that is now directed towards the right frequency. So that would, according to Emerson, that's always your first job, right? To live truly. And then when you live truly, then you will see truly.
This reminds me so much of that metaphor in John, the vine and the branches. I am the vine, you are the branches. It's like that really such a close connection. If you're saying this, the lungs of intelligence, you're breathing in that inspiration. It's like amazing.
Or last week I mentioned the transcendentalists all went to the Adirondacks to a particular area again to go away, and that would be with Thoreau, and then there's a group of them, and so you'll notice that he has references to nature.
Yes.
In that. So, to avoid all the noise is to go away and be and live or be amongst nature.
But in 1830, that was very reasonable. And in 2022, trying to find some corn in a murmur of a brook is more difficult. And if you do find the corn, there's crows in it. Crows everywhere.
Well, we are fortunate, right? Because all we have to do is, go 5 minutes west or north.
Find some soil.
Yeah,
I just visited a place
you did, right?
that you could probably do that easier than here for sure.
Yeah.
The Churchill is a community of 800 people,
Oh my gosh.
no roads in. Right now, the railroad also had been taken out by a storm, so the only way in is by plane or helicopter. And of course, the sea is right there. So you can be pretty one with your surroundings in Churchill if you choose to be.
Yeah.
So did you feel the immense intelligence, or?
I felt very cold.
But you said you saw polar bears, and that was great.
That's it. That was probably not the most interesting thing that I saw while I was up there. It was visiting with some of the people. They are very basic people. They don't have a lot of, they have a need to survive. And they live very plainly. They they have to take care of each other because that's all they have. And it's a different life there, very simple. I found it very interesting. Of course, nature is all around you there. we were saddened because we didn't see the northern lights. We would have loved to, but conditions were not such. So you have to take nature as it happens. But some of this would certainly apply to what he's talking about. You could become one with yourself.
Are those people indigenous or are they all?
There are some indigenous, some not.
You know, it reminds me of the third epigraph, right? Cast the bantling on the rocks, suckle him with a she-wolf's teeth, wintered with a hawk and fox, power and speed be hands and feet. Right? So fewer distractions, more nature, sort of more experiences that we might consider hard and difficult. Emerson would fully approve of that.
Yeah.
At the top of 8, right? That first full paragraph on 8. There are just a few cool sentences that relate here. The relations of the soul to the divine spirit are so pure that it is profane to seek to interpose helps. It must be that when God speaketh, he should communicate not one thing, but all things, should fill the world with his voice, should scatter forth light, nature, time, souls from the center of the present thought, a new date and new create the whole. Whenever a mind is simple and receives a divine wisdom, old things pass away. Means, teachers, texts, temples fall. It lives now and absorbs past and future into the present hour. All things are made sacred by relation to it, one as much as another. Right? So the lack of interposition, right? So you could see that Emerson was not a Catholic, right? He would not like the priest to be sort of between you, right? Emerson would say, well, just skip the middleman, right? And connect directly with the divine spirit, right? So that when God speaketh, you hear it, and you don't have somebody translating it for you, into Latin, which of course would have still happened at the time in the Catholic Church. So yeah, Emerson, I think you're right, Terry. He would much rather be in the Adirondacks than in the Vatican. And so here, being a teacher who loves texts, and I do love temples too, this is of course the part in where Emerson, when he says, teachers, texts, temples fall, this is where, depending on how you read him, he is either saying, forget school and all of that stuff and just run around outside. Or he's saying that if you have learned enough, right, to have your antenna directed the right direction, well, then you don't need text, teachers, temples anymore. You might need them earlier, but at some point you have to transcend them, or you don't need them at all. And so those are, and this is also how I sort of look at, our country, that part of America, and I think, my opinion, American Protestantism is profoundly anti-intellectual, right? You just wave your hand and say Jesus, and that's it, right? That's
part of American Protestant.
That's right. No, part of that. But I think that sort of comes, it's also in here, right? A total rejection of tradition. And so, this is something where it depends on how, if you look at Emerson's own life, if you look at what he's saying in general, if you look at how he's writing, just to understand Emerson, you have had to have teachers and texts, right? So he clearly is not somebody who says, be ignorant. But I think he's saying, stop being a student at some point in your life.
Was he in favor of the divide between the rural and then those that were more metropolitan?
He talks later about the sturdy lad from Vermont whom he prefers over the soft Harvard guy, right? Who's afraid of, of his own shadow. So he does like sort of, I think if Emerson, had to make a choice, he'd rather send his kid on a farm than, to a school. On the other hand, he clearly loves reading and writing and all of that. So I personally see Emerson as somebody who would say to the weakened Harvard, student, you got to get out there, right? And get your hands dirty. But I think he would also say to the sturdy lad from Vermont, you know, read some
Really
poetry.
speaking to try and reach all, or is he really speaking to some segment?
If you read this, right, I don't think all could read Emerson. So it is clearly written to people who have become maybe stuck in their heads, right? So he's clearly writing to a very intellectual audience because, you know, every other word is a reference to this philosopher and that ism and that ism. And I think Emerson is worried that people who read too much and who think too much need to get out in nature and, you know, wrestle a polar bear and sort of get in touch with something that's really simple.
I mean, it's one thing, I totally get that, like you wouldn't even encounter Emerson if you aren't in the world of education and texts and teachers. But if we were talking about Dewey, like you have other people then who take these ideas and say to a 6-year-old, like, you don't really need these texts and teachers. Like that is, I think, the question, Greg, like who's taking this in? Do we want everybody to be thinking this way? I don't know.
Yeah, partially what has come out of this, what, you know, is generally sort of called progressive education, is to say, yeah, just have a portfolio, just run around a little bit, you know, don't bother with Shakespeare and all of these kinds of things. Don't bother with grades and what have you. And that can be really detrimental to students as well. Because I think you have to have text teachers' temples first before they can fall.
You know, I was actually thinking, just reminded me, I was thinking last week about, you know, the question of the bolts and choice and like becoming not the kind of person Emerson was talking about and having followers or following a leader. And that if you were to, you know, claim or think to yourself that you are just not following this Emersonian idea, but you like it, I'm going to, you know, think for myself and just look directly at, you know, the situation and everything. But am I really? And I think a way to test that is actually to expose yourself to other ideas. Because if I have an opinion and I believe like, this is my opinion, this is my conviction, I've discerned this of my own will, you know, I haven't let anybody guide me into this or whatever, this is what I believe. But if I'm not willing to test that belief against other beliefs, like if I expose myself to something that makes me uncomfortable and doubt my own belief, then it makes me see that, you know, it's kind of an illusion to just, you know, I just have this opinion and I hold it and I think it's what I really believe, but I don't know, in a sense, it doesn't actually make sense unless I've had that belief of mine exposed in contrast to other things. So in a way, I think that if you held that, you know, as the part of the way to see, you know, if you're actually living like that, that would also prevent, you know, to a good degree, becoming a, you know, a blind follower or something to that effect, because you'd always, you know, want to expose yourself to these other ideas and actually, you know, quite try to understand it, question it.
Which is what he certainly did, right? I mean, he just, on every page, right, you see, you know, just on page 8 there, he's got David, Jeremiah, and Paul, right? And he's got Alfred and Skanderberg and Gustavus and, you know, all kinds of people listed everywhere. So Emerson himself is in that dialogue with all of the tradition, right? And he makes reference to it in almost every paragraph. There's some learned reference. Yeah, so clearly he's not just some, you know, rube who just, you know, had an idea and then just repeated that, but he's testing it against all of these other thinkers. And he mentions, you know, from the beginning, Moses, Milton, Socrates, everybody. So yeah, I think you're right.
It seems more like it's just like, you know, don't lean on them as authorities, you know, especially at the, you know, sacrifice of your own like judgment, you know, don't abandon or ignore like how you really feel about something. Don't abandon your judgment or feeling about something just to have it be replaced by something you're told or read.
Mm-hmm. I think on page 10, there's something that's maybe relevant to this, because one concern with Emerson could be that you're just going out and saying, hey, the Spirit told me to punch little kids or what have you, right? And so he says in the middle paragraph, something that may be interesting when he talks to "O Father" and "O Mother," all these O's there, 5 lines down. Once you've sort of seen the light, right, you will say to these folks, I have lived with you after appearances hitherto. Henceforward I am the truths. Be it known unto you that henceforward I obey no law less than the eternal law. I will have no covenants but proximities. I shall endeavor to nourish my parents, to support my family, and be the chaste husband of one wife. But these relations I must fill after a new and unprecedented way. I must be myself, he says in the next line. So what I think is interesting here is that he's saying, on the outside, you might see no difference, right? I'm still the chaste husband of one wife, but I'm doing it for a different reason now. So being an Emersonian, so to speak, or doing what he's saying doesn't require you to be weird, right? And be a contrarian. So you might be doing all the same things that everybody else is doing. And Emerson might say everybody else is doing it because they're told to do so. You're doing it because you're inspired to do that. So I always thought this part was kind of interesting in Emerson, because one question that always comes up is, well, what if everybody's self-reliant? Isn't that going to cause chaos? And I think he's got 2 checks against it. The first is, well, everybody who's self-reliant in an Emersonian way is connected to the same source. And if that's true, right, then there wouldn't be chaos, because we're all connected to the same one, the same God, the same transcendent reality. Therefore, we don't start wars with other Emersonian self-reliant people. And then the other check, I think, is here on page 10, that he seems to be suggesting that I'm going to do all of these same things I've always done. I'm just going to do it differently. So those are 2 ways in which Emerson, I think, is trying to suggest that his thinking isn't going to lead to the fracturing of society and to just a bunch of people who are weird for weirdness' sake.
So it's the investing of opinions of others. Totally. I mean, it's almost like John said, it's kind of a little bit of a paradox going on there. I've really changed John and Steve.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you've made your
Trust me, I've changed.
Trust.
yeah. Isn't that sort of what the Buddhists are saying, that before enlightenment, the trees are there and the mountains are there, and then after enlightenment, the trees are still there. And so you're right, nothing has really changed, but everything has changed, right? Because you have sort of become more you, but that doesn't mean that you're outwardly necessarily different. And so the bottom paragraph on page 10 has this great first sentence, I think. He says, well, the populace, right, the many, think that your rejection of popular standards is a rejection of all standard, right? So that's what people are going to think, that you reject all standards now, that you're going to, drive your car 100 miles down college, and mere antinomianism, right? That you're just against all rules, right? That's what the people are going to think about my philosophy. And the bold sensualist will use the name of philosophy to gild his crimes. Right? So the bold sensualist is going to read my stuff. He's going to say, I can do whatever I feel like doing. But Emerson really has no room for that. He's not interested in that. The fact that people are going to do that, well, he can't help that. Right? People are sensualists and selfish always. So he's not rejecting all standard. He's not rejecting the 10 commandments. He's not saying don't love your neighbor, but love your neighbor because you love your neighbor. Don't love your neighbor because otherwise you're afraid that you're not going to go to heaven. Right? So in that second case, you're actually not loving your neighbor. You're just doing it because you're afraid of punishment and you're hoping for some sort of reward, which is, you're doing the right thing, but you're not doing it for the right reasons then.
Like, it's kind of like, where have you placed the locus of control in your mind, you know?
Exactly. And some of us would say, well, put it somewhere else because your mind is so uncertain, right? And because human beings are so rotten. But Emerson thinks, no, you can trust yourself. If you live truly, right? Then you can trust yourself. So a lot of people who shouldn't trust themselves. But again, those are not reading Emerson's self-reliance, right? So I think you read Emerson's self-reliance if you've gotten a little sick and tired of the creed, right? Of just sort of doing the same thing that everybody is doing. Right? And, I mean, look at what we're doing in our service. We're not reading the Nicene Creed first, which is see, because that's very Emersonian of us in many ways, right? It's to say, well, isn't that a little outworn? Isn't that a little nah?
Or I think.
You got full control with us since you do the typing.
Or maybe it's not just getting rid of it, but saying, what does that actually mean to us today? I feel like the creed we're using is kind of like a translation or a re-authenticating.
Right, it's not a rejection of creed, right? It's not saying this old thing is total nonsense. It's just saying we have to sort of put new spirit into it, right?
And Emerson would love that.
Absolutely, right? It would have to be said in our language, right, in our times, that resonates with us today, rather than parroting something that people have said for 1,500 years. Yeah, so I think that might be a good example. Right? Yeah, not all standards are rejected.
Does that mean you have to give up that old part? I kind of like the old part.
That's where I am also, and I think I don't give up the old part, right? I'm gonna teach the Iliad tomorrow. It doesn't get older than that, right? But of course, you have to sort of, when you teach it, you have to make it accessible and likable to 2022 somehow. So if I just sat there and droned, Homer at people, it wouldn't connect. So I do like the old stuff, but the old stuff has to resonate.
Like reinvigorating.
Be relevant.
And to some of us, the old stuff resonates as the old stuff.
Mhm.
There's nothing wrong with that, right? If that is your connection to the divine, then hallelujah. But to many people, it isn't. And so then how do you translate the ideas that are in the old creed, for example, in such a way that they speak to you today?
Mhm.
Remember when you went to the rock and roll church there to do a study?
Yes,
so that-
as part of an ethnomusicology study, I visited a church called The Rock, and they do like a rock concert every Saturday night. So I just went there, I don't know for how long, for a very long time, but like, and yeah, they were just, I think that's what we're doing too. They're just trying to think like, what is it about church that's actually helps people? You know what I mean? Like trying to find the essence of something. Yeah. You think that was an Emersonian?
Well, I mean, I think all these churches are trying to, speak, their belief in their way, right? I mean, maybe some are just trying to make money, but I think a lot of those are pretty sincere.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying like we're actually the result of Emerson, like Emerson might not be speaking to us anymore since we've ingested him as a society.
And I think as an American culture, we're very Emersonian, right? Everybody's doing his own thing. And that's where, like, some of us might say, oh, it's going too far, right? You gotta find the center. So Emerson is speaking in a very homogenous society, and he is sort of the original disruptor. And that was probably really good in the 1830s. He really needed to disrupt, white Christianity in the 1830s in the United States. It was absolutely necessary. And now we live in a world where disruption all of a sudden is a good thing, rather than a sort of a scary thing that you should do only when God tells you to. So I sometimes wonder, I mean, when I moved here, certainly I thought, oh, what a weird society, right? Everything is in flux, nothing is stable, there are no traditions, everything's just a strip mall. So it did feel strange to me, but it's also invigorating. things happen, left and right, all kinds of new things pop up. Yeah, so that's the question, right? How can you have a society that's vigorous where things happen that is not entirely disconnected from the past? And I think this is where Emerson is at, right? He's speaking the language of God, of the soul, of all of these kinds of things, and he's trying to say it in new kind of ways. On page 11, he briefly talks about the sturdy lad from New Hampshire. I just want to bring that up. In the middle paragraph, 5 lines down, he says, a sturdy lad from New Hampshire or Vermont, who in turn tries all the professions, who teams it, farms it, peddles, keeps a school, preaches, edits a newspaper, goes to Congress, buys a township, and so forth. In successive years, and always, like a cat, falls on his feet, is worth 100 of these city dolls. He walks abreast with his days and feels no shame in not studying a profession. For he does not postpone his life, but he lives already. He has not one chance, but 100 chances. So this is so American to me. I mean, when growing up in Germany, of course, people have, they study something and then they work in that field, right, for their entire lives. Or even if they don't go to university, they go to a trade school, they learn a trade, and they stay in that trade forever. And then I came here and people study something and then take a job in something that's totally unrelated to what they study and do it for a few years and then do something else. And on the one hand, it leads to these discontinuities. On the other hand, people fall to their feet, right? And they have 100 chances rather than one chance. So, but notice what this guy is doing, right? He's not doing anything that's bad, of course, right? He's got a farm, he's got a school, he preaches, he's a politician, he buys a township. So all the examples that Emerson gives are creative, productive examples of somebody who actually improves the society around them, right? This is not somebody who's a old sensualist, right, who goes out and does stuff that ruins things. He's somebody, that David Brooks would call a weaver, right? Somebody who brings things together rather than takes them apart. We're on page 11, Gray and Lori, when he advertises the sturdy lad, right, who's out there trying all kinds of things. Right in the middle of page 11, right, the one who falls to his feet, studies a million things. That's the self-reliant person that Emerson wants to create or wants to encourage. And I mean, again, my experience with the people that I met when I came here was that, oh yeah, these are a bunch of Emersonians here. I didn't know it at the time, but then later when I studied Emerson, I thought, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? To me, that explained a lot of the sort of the American restlessness and the creativity. When I started teaching, all of a sudden there were new students after 2 weeks and other students left. I had never, in my entire life, I'd never seen anybody leave school in the middle of the school year. Never. All of a sudden people come, people go. And I thought, this is bad. But it's also not bad, right? Because these are people who are seeing opportunity somewhere else and they're going and taking the opportunity. So on the one hand, right, it's hard in America to build these long-term relationships and this belonging because people are gone here today and gone tomorrow. So that's the loss in all of that. But the new people who come in usually come in with a bunch of drive, right? And there's Lori, leading a stewardship campaign, right? So not staying in Grand Junction forever, like she would if she were a German. So yeah, so I feel I'm of two minds about this, this whole Emersonian project, but I certainly see some benefits.
It's interesting, I think, because it seems like there's a lot of these ideas of self-reliance, because they originated so far back, have weaved into all kinds of different ideologies. And I think there's a lot of pushback from, voices of like institutions against kind of what you're talking about, what he was just talking about, doing all the different things. I remember reading some article on Time, I think it was, maybe some education head or something, who was like, if you don't know, if you haven't picked what you're gonna do by your 30, by your 20s, and you stick to it, you're doomed, like by the time you're 30. And there's a lot of ideas of success that in a way there's like a whole aura of self-reliance around, becoming successful, but then it will be tied to something like that, just sticking to this one thing, and success defined by, money or awards or, growth in a particular career. So I do think if people revisited this, who maybe the idea of being independent appeals to them, but at the same time, they're kind of tied up in this other mentality, it could give them a fresh perspective, and that'd be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, untying yourself from your perspective is another one of those self-reliant Emersonian things, which is kind of uncomfortable. And I don't do it very well. I'm not that interested in it, to be honest, like my perspectives. But that is, of course, this, what do the Buddhists call it? So this non-attachment, right, is something I think that this sturdy lad is able to do, right? He farms for a few years, and I'm done farming. I started school now. Now I'm done with that. Yeah, and so that's, and again, I see the benefits of non-attachment. I see the problems with it as well. But for an energetic society, which the United States clearly is, this is sort of the profit of that kind of society.
I feel like it means too that the people we do encounter at St. Paul's as an example, or in your school as an example, because there is so much choice, there's an actual, like a genuine desire to be here. Like there's a reason why people come here, and it's not just like, well, I feel like it's what I have to do. So there's some kind of like commitment maybe to showing up.
Places or groups you join because you want to are different than being forced to amalgamate with the lot. All the Osher is one. Those people come because they want to learn.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, just walk into a school. Students don't want to be there, but the teachers don't even want to be there.
Because you want to be there, and also you have to become much more patient, forgiving. Those sort of things that may be spoken or others that are, different than what you have, as far as expectations.
If you want to be somewhere,
Generally, your expectations grow as a result of that.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you wouldn't stay.
Yeah. No, you have to be, when you're committing to something from your own choice, and now you have to sort of then also have these conversations. Maybe that could be potentially difficult, because I am attached to this now. Yeah, now we have to interact. But it's all the difference whether you're doing it because you want to, or they're doing it because somebody made you go. Yeah, right. We talked about your grandkids, right? I mean, it's you can't sort of. It's hard, right, to say you got to go to this church and you better like it. You gotta love Jesus, or I'm gonna spank you. Right? That's just doesn't really probably work this way.
I know some people would go just for that. Getting spanked, sure.
Yeah, it's the old model. Speaking of that, at the bottom of page 11, he goes and talks about what prayers people allow themselves, right? So he talks about prayer at the bottom of page 11.
Why didn't he throw in a series of 4 numbers all of a sudden?
Because he's critiquing 4 different things.
Including travel.
Yeah, prayer, travel, education, and art and society. But when he talks about prayer, look at what he says. It's kind of interesting. That which they call a holy office is not so much as brave and manly. Prayer looks abroad and asks for some foreign addition to come through, some foreign virtue, and loses itself in endless mazes of natural and supernatural and mediatorial and miraculous. Prayer that craves a particular commodity, anything less than all good, is vicious. Prayer, now he says what prayer really is. Prayer is the contemplation of the facts of life from the highest point of view. It is the soliloquy of a beholding and jubilant soul. It is the Spirit of God pronouncing his works good. But prayer as a means to effect a private end is meanness and theft It supposes dualism and not unity in nature and consciousness. Right? So that's an interesting,
As
Yeah.
soon as the man is at one with God, he will not beg.
yeah,
That's just the next one.
right.
He will then see prayer in all action. It's really interesting.
Yeah, so the self-reliant prayer is almost sort of the living of your life.
I'm so interested to see how this interacts with the next series, because I feel like it might be the Emersonians of theology you're talking to and thinking about. People who say like authentically, I need to do this way, or yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting to see how these dovetail, because, yeah. The only thing I don't hear in his voice, and it's probably there in other places, is the concern for those who are less privileged and for folks who are poor and who are ostracized, marginalized, and so on. And so therefore, I mean, they have, of course, their own relationship to the holy, but what's our responsibility? So I don't hear that in this.
Yeah, there isn't that much in there, right? I mean, I think, he's a little more sort of libertarian, right? He might say, well, my service to community is that I am self-reliant, so I'm not a burden on other people. Maybe I'm an inspiration to other people to also become self-reliant. So,
Yeah.
But
so
he
he
talks
doesn't,
about the people who belong to him, who he would go to jail for.
right,
Yeah.
right. So the beginning there. Yeah, no, I think to him, the greatest good you can do to the community is to be you, right? And then maybe if you can encourage other people to become that too.
Do you think his perception was that, partly because of the time and place he was in, that people could just, choose to go get a plot of land and fill it and they'd be fine, and then they just weren't doing that, or more that, they might be in a situation of poverty, but it's just not his responsibility, or maybe even if they are in a hard place, physically and systemically, you might say, they still have the choice to just be happy in some sense, or like, does he just not really comment on just that very much in the first place, except for, a few things he said in here?
Yeah, I mean, so he was obviously opposed to slavery, right? Because it doesn't work with self-reliance. So he was working against it, as it was outspoken against it. But I think, for sort of the people who could, I think he would say, in this country, you can actually go and get your plot of land, which you can't do in Germany or in England, right? So I think he would say, don't whine about lack of opportunities here, unless obviously you're enslaved or what have you, in which case I am working with the abolitionists against him.
He was also really generous, because I remember I worked intensively on Thoreau for a while, and Emerson actually financed Thoreau's year in nature. That was
Right.
because Emerson was footing the bill. So I feel like he was actually, like, his practice was to be a really generous person. And I think when he says, the people who belong to me, I will do a lot for them, I think he meant that. But maybe it was more that private generosity than the relief society that he
I wonder
criticized.
if he also then maybe thinks that poverty is like a symptom of lack of liberty in some way. So, and since he did think that, if people are free, then they'll be able to find the means. But, the way to fight poverty is really to fight the systems that prevent people from like having their own rights to. I don't know.
No, and it is also the education of being cast on the rocks and being resilient, right? I think Emerson would counsel anybody who thinks, oh, I can't do it. It's like, come on. So he would say, why don't you take a job, right? There are plenty. Why don't you go west, right? There's room, right? So as long as there are opportunities, I think he would say, look out for yourself, right? I mean, so he would be one of those, help others, help themselves people, rather than create another system of dependence, right? Where you now have people who are needing your relief society.
Yeah, but it kind of assumes a different time, like you were saying.
Right.
It's a time when there are plots of land and there are opportunities and the people who are free can go do it.
Mhm.
Sounds, that piece of it sounds like my father, he was always saying, well, these poor people here, this panhandler over here, they ought to just go get a job and get busy, and not so easy as that, but, yeah.
Yeah, but again, so if, let's say for a vast portion of the population, entirely possible. Right, I mean, if you look now, I think it's pretty easy to get a job. I see help wanted signs everywhere. And so I think you would say you can probably, right? And of course, if there are significant things in the way, then that's a different story. And again, then you're probably not meeting self-reliance, and there are different issues at stake.
Yeah, there are different starting points, I guess, that,
Mhm.
that I see certainly when people are being able to read and write, having the kind of clothes that make you presentable in a job situation, being the right color oftentimes.
Yeah.
All sorts of things that sort of mitigate against just being able to go get a job.
I think that's why he talks about the sturdy lad from Vermont and New Hampshire, which all the elites look down on. Right. And Emerson would say, no, that guy is actually, he's got you. Right. He's going to outwork you. He's going to outsmart you a million times. So I think he does, in that little paragraph there, does point out that you don't have to have any privileges. As a matter of fact, it might be advantageous to you to not have had those privileges and spend your years at Harvard. Instead, if you work on a farm, as far as Emerson is concerned, you probably actually you'll get ahead from there. So I think that's maybe part of what he would say. You don't need the privileges. It's actually
in the States, there was a homestead act, 40 acres, and you will.
But again, that
Absolutely, yeah.
assumes that you're.
If you're
the sort of
white.
person who would fit into that community, At least marginally so. I mean, a lot of frontier territories, we're very egalitarian in terms of, you don't have to, all you have to do is show up and help bend your neighbor's fences and you were in. But there's still some really basic things against that, and especially now there are. And this whole issue of the folks who own the land, but were on the land first, and got kicked off the reservation. There's a lot of things that make it a little more complicated.
You get into, who owns the majority of the wealth? This little small percentage.
Yeah. No, that's true, of course. And I think Emerson is not interested in wealth, right? He's interested in having the divine spirit communicate with your soul and you saying what needs to be said. You don't need money for that. So it can certainly happen without any privilege.
Times, yeah, population are smaller. Just your communities, church or somewhere, there's kind of your self-reliance, and then there's the self-reliance, you be a member of that community and contributing to its survival, if you will.
Yeah.
And they no doubt have their ne'er-do-wells they want to talk about, right? In the same church, not church going. Reasons for that. Probably not at the level now where your information sources, you're just constantly bombarded with who those are by somebody's viewpoint. The hardest thing to do with our media source now is to realize that 90+% of what you're hearing out there is commentary. It's personal viewpoint. It's not
That's true.
a factual sort of a thing. And yet, more and more we treat it as if this is a trustworthy person of that source of news.
Which would be a very non-self-reliant way of consuming the news, right? Again, you have to, I think he would say you got to clean that stuff out of your system.
Yeah.
Right? Go for a walk in the mountains rather than looking at your phone.
Turn the electronics off.
Right. He says all kinds of stuff, but I want to get to the end. I mean, he talks about American artists, etc. Just on the very last page, there are two things I want to point out. I think they connect actually. If you look at the big middle paragraph, He talks about property. That's sort of appropriate. And so the reliance on property, including the reliance on governments which protect it, is the want of self-reliance. Men have looked away from themselves at things so long that they have come to esteem the religious, learned, and civil institutions as guards of property, and they deprecate assaults on these because they feel them to be assaults on property. They measure their esteem of each other by what each has and not by what each is. So again, obviously you have to have enough to eat and drink and be merry and all that kind of stuff. But again, he's saying don't value stuff, right? Value who you are. And then just the last 3-4 lines are probably apropos the election season, right? Just in the middle of the fourth to last line. He says, a political victory, a rise of rents, the recovery of your sick, or the return of your absent friend, or some other favorable event raises your spirits and you think good days are preparing for you. Do not believe it. Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles.
I like that.
Right?
That's interesting.
It's a nice way to end, isn't it? Well, I hope you got, I mean, yeah, I hope you got some sort of interest in, I mean, if this made you interested in reading a few of his other essays, he got a famous essay called Nature, right? That was actually his sort of his breakthrough, was his essay called Nature, in which he talks about what nature is and our relationship to it. He's got essays on friendship. He's got all kinds of really nice meditations on different topics that we'd probably all be interested in. And they're all sort of like this, right? Some that we say, oh, I don't know, which is exactly what he would want, right? It'd be crazy for him to write something that is coherent, because then you would say, you know, so he has to have things in his essays that are going to not connect, because that means you as a reader have to find your position vis-a-vis the sort of moving target that he presents.
You have to be self-reliant when you read Emerson.
And it's a kind of training in self-reliant reading.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Really
Thank
good.
you.
for
Thank
doing
you.
this.
For doing it. Or I was gonna say, for his time period, he probably was kind of a figurehead of social justice because of his strong advocacy of abolition. And because of this turning away from the privileged institutions of Harvard and Yale. Like I don't know if you were here the first time when Florence said he got disinvited from the.
Yes, I
Harvard
was,
University.
yeah.
Yeah, so he was like willing to kind of turn his nose up to those privileged institutions. But I think we are so much more sensitive to all sorts of populations, but in his time period, it was the enslaved people that were needing the most advocacy. So I think in his mind, he really was like kind of advocating for social justice, is my impression. I mean, not that that's totally important to the essay, but.
And what he just said about property goes into that, you know?
Yeah.
Because he's basically saying, give up your privilege.
Yep.
You know, give that stuff up, that's not.
It's not
Yeah.
Which is.
It's just-
Give your stuff.
seems to be what Jesus said too to the rich man. So, right. And he did invite women to the transcendentalist circles, which was, in the 1830s, a remarkable thing to do. So he, in some sense, maybe by 2022 standards, he could be even more sensitive, but by 1830 standards, Emerson was certainly a voice in the wilderness who sort of pushed against the man, right? And sort of what was the general view of things. And I think he's had a huge influence on sort of the American way of thinking, which I think you can see when you read this, like, oh yeah, so that's how we roll in many ways. And he articulates that, and then people take that and run with it. Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks, thank you.
Thanks for your singing, John.
Thanks.